Hello and welcome to the Blueprint Canada's Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock in the beautiful province of Ontario. I'm broadcasting live from my constituency office in Lindsay, and we have, as always, a great show lined up for you today. Thanks for joining us. Before we get to our guests, remember, we need your help to push back against the ever-moving Liberal agenda, so we need you to like, subscribe, comment, and share on this content. And of course, if you aren't able to watch us here on platforms like Facebook, you can also download the content and listen to us through your audio device. And you can get it through various platforms like Google Play, iTunes, Castbox, Spotify. It's all there in a wide range of examples for you to take and maybe even show your friends and have them listen to the content and help this movement. And as mentioned, we have an amazing show lined up for you. In the second half, we have James Bezan. He's the Member of Parliament for Selkirk-Interlake-Eastman in Manitoba. He's also the Shadow Minister for National Defence. We're going to talk about some of the work the Canadian Forces have been doing during the COVID-19 pandemic and a few other issues as well. But first, we have our Deputy Leader, our military veteran, Leona Alleslev. She's the Member of Parliament for Aurora-Oak, Ridges-Richmond Hill, and also the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us here, Leona.
Awesome to be here, Jamie. How's it going?
I love your background. Well done.
Well, thank you. If we're not talking about politics and Security Council and safety and security, we can talk about airplanes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we thank you for your service. Let's start with something that's kind of on the minds of, I think, a lot of people within the political spectrum. Of course, the mainstream media have put this off. It's not even being talked about anymore. And if you weren't paying attention for probably a 24-hour period, you probably wouldn't know this had happened. But Canada lost its bid for its place on the rotating seat of the UN Security Council.
Exactly. And I'm really quite stunned at why it hasn't got more media attention, because it is a very significant event. It's a sad day for Canada, and it really is a wake-up call for Canada, because this is essentially the world's report card on what they think of Canada. And if the world needs more Canada, then why did the world vote against us and essentially say, no thanks?
I think it's important to remember when you talk about that. Of course, Stephen Harper lost that seat as well. But I think it's important to remember that back when Stephen Harper was going for that rotating seat, he got more votes than Justin Trudeau did. And you remember at the time, over and over again, we heard from the media, we heard from so-called experts, we heard from the Liberals, the left, saying that Canada has lost its compass, the world isn't respecting us, but yet we actually got more votes back when Stephen Harper tried to make that go.
Absolutely. And I think that we have to look at it in context as well, because the situation in the world is dramatically different today. And one of the main promises and campaigns of Justin Trudeau and the Liberals is that Canada would be back, not that Canada had gone anywhere, but that they were going to re-engage, they were going to re-establish Canada's position on the world stage, and that Canada was back. And yet, clearly, this is a report card on the fact that we are not only not back, but we're probably more alone than ever.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. What do you think happened? It was obviously a series of incidents and missteps by this government that allowed this to happen. But can you maybe summarize in a few big issues that may have hampered our push for this seat?
I think we have to look at it exactly like you said, as a pattern of behavior. So first and foremost, we need to look at what do our allies and security partners think of us? What is our foreign policy on that front? We've made commitments to increase spending on NATO to 2% and to have a capability in Canada. The Justin Trudeau Liberals said that they were going to spend more on defense and that they were going to get a fighter capability. and that they were going to engage. But what did they actually do? They bought 40-year-old fighters that are humiliating and an embarrassment not only for us, but in terms of our capability. They are one of the lowest contributors to defense of all the 29 NATO allied countries. We have failed to ban Huawei, even though we've got the United States and our Five Eyes partners telling us that we're a risk, and they will be having to look at what intelligence sharing they do with us if we don't take this more seriously, even to the fact that the Americans placed national security tariffs on our steel and aluminum because they viewed us as a national security threat. So if we're at the UN and we're looking at how we're going to gain votes from our allies, those are not the behaviors of a trusted ally and security partner. Then we look at the next group of issues around where we are in terms of our human rights defenses and the things that we say that we're going to stand up for human rights and the rule of law and protecting most vulnerable people. And that's definitely been a foundation of this Liberal government. And yet, they are failed to condemn countries that have anti-gay laws. They've failed to stand up to dictators and human rights abusers. They're silent on any number of issues. So if you're looking for votes from partners, countries that say we can trust that Canada will be a reliable and dependable partner in terms of defense of human rights, I think that this Liberal government has eroded any notion that actions speak louder than words, and they'll be there to really stand up when it counts.
Now,
and then
go ahead.
I have a third theme, and that's around diplomacy and decorum, because ultimately the person, the country that you want on a UN Security Council seat, you want them to be diplomatic, decorum, and stand and have appropriate behavior. And the Prime Minister is a reflection of our country, and the way that the Prime Minister behaved in India, in China, in any number of international scenarios where he confused China and Japan, where he didn't show up for critical trade negotiations with our Asia Pacific partners repeatedly. He has not only been an embarrassment to Canada, but he has shown the world that he's not going to behave with the decorum and diplomacy and approach that I think the world would be looking at for a UN Security Council seat. So from not being a trusted ally and partner to not standing up for principled and human rights defenses, to not behaving in a manner accordance with the UN Security Council seat, this government and this Prime Minister has ensured that we don't have the trust and confidence of the world, and that's why they voted against us. And that is a dramatic and drastic position for Canada to be in when we need our relationships with the world.
I would definitely agree with you. I'm glad you pointed out the failures to show up at a number of meetings with some key trading partners and kind of brushing that off like it was no big deal. Clearly, they remembered that, and clearly it was an issue. So let's talk about you mentioned the moves that the government made. So let's talk about its peacekeeping effort in Mali. You know, you're very familiar with that. This is something the government dithered on for the longest time, trying to pick something that they could maybe get some points for with some of their African bloc countries, but also they almost couldn't make a decision on what to do. Maybe you can go in a bit more detail about that.
Well, the fact that our contribution, Canada's contribution to peacekeeping, and has been the lowest in 60 years, that we have less than, I don't even know, 60 people or something, a very low number, whereas 15, 20 years ago, we were known as peacekeepers. It's part of who we are as Canadians and what we believe we bring to the world. And I think we as Canadians have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, who we think we are is not actually who we are and how we are behaving because of this government. And so it's no wonder that when the UN asked us to step up and do peacekeeping, we basically, as you said, waited forever, delivered almost nothing. And then even when they asked us to extend, we decided to leave, and therefore can't necessarily be counted on for the peacekeeping commitments that we say we're known for, and yet in reality that's no longer the case. And that's why I say it's a very sad day for Canada, because I do think that that's who Canadians believe we are and we should be, and this government is not delivering that and not standing true to those principles.
Now, personally, I have some issues with the UN Security Council in general, given the fact that there are two very big bad actors that have veto power, that being Russia and China. I personally, and this is my personal opinion, that the council needs to be looked at again. It probably won't happen, but there are some concerns about who is kind of running the UN in a number of committees. You look at the Human Rights Council, there are some pretty bad actors that are looking after human rights, so to speak. And I think it's ripe for reform anyway, in my personal opinion.
And so I would agree with you, but I do still think that there is a role for the United Nations and for multilateral institutions and for the Security Council. And so simply by virtue of the fact that there's bad actors doesn't mean that we can't have a conversation and influence those bad actors in a more positive direction. If you're not at the table with a principled foreign policy, standing for what you and many other nations like you believe in, then they're not even going to have to take those ideas into consideration. So while they may have a veto right, they still have to listen to the conversation that's going on, and you still have the opportunity to influence. And so I think it's very disappointing that Canada, with the principles that we used to have, but apparently don't have under this prime minister any longer, didn't have the opportunity to have that seat at the table and bring what we have been known for and continue to be that reliable and dependable partner. But that's not who we are. And that is, I believe, who we must work to be once again, and to be able to influence those multilateral institutions in the right direction simply by virtue of being there. And that's what Canada could and should bring to a United Nations Security Council seat, but that under this government, the world didn't have the trust and confidence that that's how we would behave in that position, and that's why they voted against us.
So do we have a price tag yet? How much did this cost taxpayers? Do we know?
Oh, heavens. I think that no matter what number they give us, it won't include all of the time, the energy of the people who were involved, the things that were neglected as a result of them dedicating time and attention to this, and ultimately the damage to our reputation because we did put a significant effort into it and yet didn't have the principled foreign policy, the prime minister, and the ministers to put Canada in a positive light so that we could earn the trust and confidence of those voting and vote for us.
And I think just on to close it out, I guess we talked earlier about the views of other countries on how they look at Canada. And only about a month or two ago, there was some statements put out by a former Australian Prime Minister, I believe it was, that basically said when Justin Trudeau showed up for a meeting, it was not about substance, it was about how his socks looked, and there were some real issues that needed to be discussed, and real issues that other countries were looking to Canada for some leadership that they never got.
I know, and that is tragic because ultimately Canada is viewed by many other countries through the lens of the person who represents us. And the person who represents us right now is Justin Trudeau. So to be known as a country for not having substance and not taking these issues seriously and not being a trusted ally, security partner, diplomat, decorum, all those kinds of things as a result of the behavior of our Prime Minister and the ministers that he's chosen to surround himself with, that's a very sad day for Canada. And ultimately, Canada is a trading nation, and we are dependent on the relationships that we have with other countries, and people trade with people they trust, and people trust with people they feel secure with. And that's probably one of the significant reasons why Canada is having difficulty from our trade relationships as much as our defense, security, and multilateral relationships. So that's why this country needs conservatives with principled foreign policy, an understanding of who we are, what we bring to the world stage, and why we can regain the trust and confidence. But we don't have the luxury of time because Canada is not in a good position for where we need to be.
Any parting shots? That was a great way to end it. But if you have anything else, fire away, my friend from maybe 45 minutes away.
Exactly. All I would say is that if the world needs more Canada, then why are we so alone right now? And that's because of this Prime Minister and his failed foreign policy approach.
Well,
Thanks,
I can probably tell you if Andrew Scheer was Prime Minister right now and we lost that UN Security Council seat, the media would still be talking about it and we'd still be hearing about it from so-called experts.
But we wouldn't have lost the UN Security Council seat because we know what we stand for, and we'd be able to regain the trust and confidence of the world in us.
Well said. Leona Alleslev, Member of Parliament for Aurora-Oak, Ridges-Richmond Hill, not too far away from where I'm sitting right now. She's also the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and the Shadow Minister for Global Affairs. Thank you very much for taking the time. A friend of the show, second time or third time on. Really appreciate it.
All the best.
All right. We have James Bezan getting ready to come in for the second half. We do appreciate Leona's time. Remember, very important, like, comment, subscribe, share this content. Help us push back against the ever-moving Liberal agenda. Part 2 coming up momentarily. And as always, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint. We are back for the second half of the Blueprint, Canada's Conservative podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, broadcasting live from my constituency office in beautiful Lindsay, Ontario. We had a great guest, Leona Alleslev, the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada in the first half, but another great guest, a friend of the show, probably second or third time on, James Bezan. He's the member of parliament for Selkirk-Interlake-Eastman in beautiful Manitoba. He's also the Shadow Minister for National Defense. Thank you very much for joining us, James.
Hey, thanks for bringing me into the show. I always enjoy being with you on this, Jamie.
And I got my hair cut today. Ontario's starting to open up in certain parts of the province. I asked for the James Bezan haircut, and this is as close as they could get. So they knew who you were.
Yeah, there you go. Now we're brothers in name as well.
Absolutely.
Name and hair.
Exactly. But even though summer is fast approaching, we do not slow down here on the Blueprint. We are continuing to put out content so that our members and our friends can share it and allow others to pick up on the message and show that, yes, we are continuing to fight for Canadians, even though the Liberals don't want Parliament, even though the Liberals want fake Parliament. But the other people who are working for us during COVID-19 are our friends in the Canadian Armed Forces. They are working hard and picking up where systems have failed in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and so I was pleased that the government finally announced that there is going to be some hazard pay for our military, somewhere around $70 a day. Let's keep in mind that our military, even though they sign up for danger and they are deployed around the world into some very hazardous situations, we got to remember that the job that they're doing right now is something that was never foreseen. Even though we deployed over 1,800 troops into long-term care facilities in Ontario and Quebec, in each unit of 12 members who would go onto the floor in these various facilities, only one had any medical experience. Either they're a nurse, a doctor, or a medic. And so, because the rest of the troops were all, infantry, Navy sailors, or some of them could have been from the Air Force, they were never trained to deal with proper care of individuals in long-term care facilities, how to make sure that our loved ones are protected. And they did yeoman service. And I look at the report that they issued for Ontario and Quebec as to the situations they found, and reported what need to be reported up to officials and investigators so that those that are responsible can be held to account. But over 50 of them became infected with COVID-19. So I think it is important that these individuals who had no medical training for the most part, and learned in a very short period of time how to properly use PPE, deserve to be not only recognized but also compensated for taking on this hazardous work.
And we do want to thank the members of the Canadian Forces who went in, like you said, with very little training, if at all, and saw some pretty horrible things inside some of those facilities and actually raised the red flag to the higher ups in the chain of command that there were some problems, and that is causing provincial governments to really rethink how long-term care is done in this country.
Yeah, and I don't think any of us can thank them enough. And they are slowly now starting to, leave those facilities as provinces are able to step in with volunteers, with new trained personnel, and in a lot of cases, facilities were taken over by the regional health authorities to ensure that proper care is given to our loved ones. But it was ground zero of the COVID-19 pandemic. 80% of the losses that we experienced in country because of the pandemic has been in these long-term care facilities. And so it just proves again that our armed forces, those brave men and women who serve in uniform, are able to take on all sorts of tasks, whether it's fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan, or whether it's fighting forest fires in BC and Alberta and across this country, or going into long-term care facilities and compassionately caring for our grandparents and our parents. That in itself is an amazing story, and really one that we can never say thank you enough to those who serve.
You're absolutely right. We as government officials are members of parliament, and of course the government in general, through the governor general, asks military to do a lot of hard things, and some of the things that we ask them to do is use equipment that is not up to par. Leona mentioned that in the first half of the show about the fighter jets that were purchased from Australia that were just as old as the fighter jets they were replacing. Massive problems with that. There are articles after article, and I'm just looking at one here from McDonaldLaurier.ca. It was published on January 21st, 2019. The headline is Canada has the worst military procurement system in the Western world, and that comes, I guess, as no shock to you after we watched what happened in the last 5 years.
I've been on this file now for over 9 years, and I love working with our troops and with those that serve in the Department of National Defense. And procurement is a difficult task in itself, but it has gone completely downhill as it's been politicized by the Liberals. What's the first thing that Justin Trudeau said when he was running for Prime Minister is that he would not buy a particular fighter jet. And now we've been stuck with the current fleet of CF-18s, which are way past their best before date, spending millions and millions of dollars in trying to keep them in the air and upgrading them. We just learned last week that there's another, a few $100 million that are being thrown at our fighter fleet for them to be upgraded in the United States. They're not even, it's another sole source contract by the Liberals where there is absolutely no spin-offs for Canadian aerospace industry. So, this again proves that just because of one ill-informed campaign promise by Justin Trudeau, the Liberals will spend taxpayer money and put our troops at risk just to fulfill their crazy ideology. So, the other thing that's come out in the last little bit, Jamie, is that the Department of National Defense did their own independent audit of the defense procurement strategy over the next 20 years. And there's $553 billion, so over $500 billion of taxpayer money that's going to supposedly be spent on defense equipment for our troops. And badly needed. We're talking new planes, new ships, new land vehicles. These are things that our troops need. And yet already over a third of those projects are behind schedule and over budget. And one of the reasons it's happening is that there's only 3 people, the entire department in the Canadian Armed Forces and National Defense, that are overseeing the spending of this $553 billion. That's ridiculous. Nobody in private industry will 3 people overseeing the rollout of that amount of money. And this is, where's the accountability and trust and the fiduciary duty with the taxpayer? Where is the responsibility to provide the equipment that those that volunteer to serve our country in uniform? And, it again just goes back to, the mismanagement of the Liberals, that they've often, tried to, make these virtual signals and, try to buy votes, and will say anything, but then really fall short on the, so-called deliverology. They're all about the announcements. I put up a funny, tongue-in-cheek shot at Minister Sagen today on Twitter and on Facebook. He has now 3 different occasions has announced the construction of the joint supply ships out at C-SPAN in Vancouver. We first announced that supply ship, back in 2008. The Liberals re-announced it in 2017, 2018, and again this year. And every time they announce these ships, it gets more expensive. So Sagen, please quit announcing the JSS because every time you do, you're just costing the taxpayers more money.
Well, I'd also argue this is something that Mark Norman was very familiar with, and that is something that unfortunately he lost his career because he recognized what was going on and tried to do the best he could for the men and women of the armed forces based on the circumstances.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jamie, because what happened to Vice Admiral Mark Norman is just a sad tale in itself, but it really speaks to the larger, chill that has settled across the Canadian Armed Forces under Justin Trudeau and Minister Harjit-Sajjan. They have put in place, first of all, lifetime gag orders, these non-disclosure agreements that everybody in national defense now has to sign if they're dealing with any procurement project, something that was never heard of before. And it's about taking that extra measure to hold people accountable and ensure that they're not leaking. So when Vice Admiral Mark Norman got thrown under the bus, Trudeau was trying to send a message to the troops that, I don't care if you did it or not, we're going to make sure that you don't have a voice and are able to blow the whistle on misspending or mismanagement under his tenure. And so, that continues on to this day. And I don't know if you saw just in the last couple of weeks, when the armed forces issued their report on the state of the long-term care facilities and how bad it was, they again issued the report They handed it off to officials, and then it went up the chain and then sat on somebody's desk, whether it was Minister Sajan's and PMO or Minister Blair's office. Nobody's admitting up to it. But came out through the media again that this report had been written and it hadn't been released to the public, and it should have been released to the public as soon as it was written. And of course, what happened is, again, more directives coming down on the department that they will not be allowed to speak to the media about anything. So again, they're quashing the rights of individuals to step forward through normal processes to talk about mismanagement and political motivated decisions that are happening within the forces that need to be stopped. And where we see that political interference right away, you see the PMO just coming down with a hammer to make sure that nobody speaks out.
And where's the media outrage? Where is that media outrage?
Exactly. So, again, we have a media that's been very selective and are spending more time praising the Prime Minister than actually looking at how he has mishandled everything from, COVID-19, racking up 50% more international debt, a deficit this year that's going to surpass what our spending was during our time in government. And, you just have to shake your head about, this is why Trudeau doesn't want Parliament sitting. He knows the media is going to go easy on him. He's bought them off with, increased funding to CBC, as well as all the money that he's spent now, $650 million a year in making sure that, all the media that, toe the line with the Liberal Party are compensated with subsidies. Well, I can tell you that, it's a sad state of affairs when we do not have a real true free press, and they aren't the fifth estate anymore holding the government to account. And that's why it's even now more important than ever that we have a fully functioning parliament, so that us as opposition MPs can question the government and hold them to account.
Another beautiful way to end it. I always ask if there are any parting words. I'll do it anyway, although you did end that perfectly.
Well, and if it was perfect, then we should just leave well enough alone. Thanks,
Okay.
Jamie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. We'll have you on again because we do have some other important things that we want to talk to the viewers and listeners about that is going on in your riding, but we'll have you on another time very soon, and we'll talk about that important news coming out of your area.
Sounds great.
And I know you're a great champion of that. I will put that in there and put that as a teaser for those that are listening and viewing. So thank you, James Bezan. He's the Member of Parliament for Selkirk-Interlake-Eastman. He's also the Shadow Minister for National Defence, a good friend of the show, been on about 2 or 3 times. And again, we're going to have him on a 4th time if his schedule allows, which I'm sure it will. So as always, remember, we have to stress this. We got to like, comment, subscribe, share to the program. We need your help in pushing against the ever-moving Liberal agenda. And of course, if you can't watch us here on Facebook, you can also listen to us on platforms like Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, CastBox, you name it, we're out there, all to help push back against that agenda. So thank you very much for joining us. We will be back again next Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We don't stop. We're going to continue on and help push out content so that we're able to keep Canadians informed, because Justin Trudeau, as James Bezan eloquently pointed out, does not want us in Parliament. So we have to try every means possible to get that message out. Thank you very much for joining us. 1:30 next Tuesday, Eastern Time. We'll be back. Low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint. Thanks for joining us.